Good afternoon. It's great to see you all here after lunch. My name is David DeMora. I'm the Director of Special Projects here at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. It's really wonderful to see all of you, and it's my privilege to both introduce and moderate our panel this afternoon. The panel is about the impact of trauma, the degree of trauma that so many people in the juvenile and adult criminal justice systems experience, and how to develop effective systems and modalities of response. Before we jump into this, and I will tell you, we have a tremendous panel, a lot of topics to cover. We are going to speak fairly quickly, and we are going to move fairly quickly to try to cover as much as we can. I would like you to please go to your app if you have not already done so. Polling question number 6, which relates to the issue of trauma, and the question is, in screening for trauma, do you screen differently for juveniles and adults? If you would be so kind, if you have not already responded to that, to do so, and we will give you the results of that at the end of this panel. I'd first like to introduce Ojjdp Administrator Robert Listenbee. On March 25, 2013, Mr. Listenbee assumed the role of Administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Previously, he'd been appointed to the Federal Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice, which advises the President, Congress, and the Ojjdp Administrator on juvenile justice policy. As co-chair of the Attorney General's National Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence, Mr. Listenbee was instrumental in the development of recently released recommendations for a national response to address children's exposure to violence. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Listenbee.
Thank you very much, David, for that introduction, and good afternoon again. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here representing the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. I know there's been a lot of discussion about what's happening in our adult system, and I want to just focus for a moment on what's going on in our juvenile justice system. But first things first, I'd like to acknowledge my boss, Attorney General Loretta Lynch, who spoke very eloquently today in her keynote address. I'd also like to acknowledge Valerie Jarrett, Special Assistant to the President, who spoke here this morning, and Assistant Attorney General Carol V. Mason, who will moderate tomorrow's opening plenary, also my boss, and the Honorable Julian Castro, Secretary of the Housing and Urban Development, who will be here this afternoon for a closing plenary. I'd also like to acknowledge this incredible panel here, colleagues who are going to talk about an issue that I think is one of the most important, not discussed issues in the criminal justice and juvenile justice systems in our nation. Throughout the next 3 days, we will focus on the conference theme, practical strategies to help deliver results. Sorry about that. And I would like to add, achieve positive outcomes for our justice-involved youth. I attend or present at many conferences during the course of a year. However, I'm always surprised and pleased when youth voices are incorporated into the discussion as we're going to have today. Last month, during the Council of State Governments 50 State Forum meeting, we heard from 4 youth who said that while they were in custody, their lives were turned around by one adult who went above and beyond the call of duty. Let me say that again, because each one of them said that their lives have been transformed by one adult who went above and beyond the call of duty. And also, that adult believed in them and cared about them and promised never to give up on them. And one of the young ladies on the panel had talked about going back to someone years later, long after they were outside of that official responsibility for dealing with that young person. It could be a probation officer, it could be someone else who's paid to work with him, or someone who's not. Youth are telling us how to transform their lives. We must listen to what they're saying. Similar to the organizations represented on this panel, my agency's priorities are about preventing and addressing trauma. However, we do specifically this work for children and youth, and as it relates to changing the trajectory of their lives after leaving being system involved. Unfortunately, childhood abuse, neglect, and exposure to other traumatic stressors, also known as adverse childhood experiences, are also very common. As many of you know, back in 1995, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Kaiser Permanente began the initial phase of an ACE study of 17,000 participants, the largest ever assessment associating harmful experiences in childhood with well-being in later life. When I say later life, we're talking about people in their 60s and 70s affected by childhood experiences. The 10 items on the ACE study scale are physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, mother treated violently, household substance abuse, household mental health illness, parental separation or divorce, and incarcerated household member. 2/3 of the study participants reported at least one ACE factor, and more than 1 in 5 reported 3 or more. As co-chair of the Attorney General's National Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence, we documented the fact that 6 out of 10 children are exposed to violence or witness violence or involved with violence each year, and that exposure can lead to trauma. Too many children with high ACE scores enter the juvenile and criminal justice systems, and one of our top priorities is reducing those numbers. According to the National Institute of Justice study, being abused or neglected as a child will likely increase the arrests as a youth by 59%, increase adult arrests and criminal behavior by 28%, and increase adult violent behavior by 30%. Recently, I heard Dr. Lindsay Malloy speak on stress, trauma, and child development at a meeting with our various programs addressing violence. Her presentation echoed findings of a study we commissioned on adolescent brain development from the National Research Council. That study identified adolescent development as a time of rapid, often unbalanced neurological and behavioral growth. To that, Dr. Malloy adds that chronic stress is a physical, social, emotional, and cognitive burden on a developing child. It can derail normal development of a child. She noted children's reaction to short-lived and chronic stress differs. Some are very resilient, as do the consequences of children's exposure to each type of stress. Many children are mislabeled as delinquent, who are actually the most traumatized. That's precisely why, in addition to addressing the core protections of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act and reducing out-of-home placement, our agency prioritizes supporting a comprehensive, trauma-informed approach to reforming juvenile justice. Despite our best efforts, many youth still become system-involved. We at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention are working to ensure every young person entering the juvenile justice system is screened and assessed for trauma, and we want to encourage you to do the same. We hope to have trauma-informed systems as a part of all the juvenile justice systems across the nation. It's also important that detention facilities personnel receive the appropriate trauma-informed training so that when kids come in, they can recognize when our children have been exposed to trauma. The same way we want teachers, the same way we want others who come in to be also aware of the screening required. Alternatively, reducing restrictions when kids are inside of detention facilities helps reduce their negative reactions and helps also improve their interactions with the staff. In addition, proper resources to support the well-being of staff is important. If we have staff who know that they are receiving the proper kind of treatment themselves for the traumas that they're experiencing as they take care of our children, that will help them in their interaction with the children and with their families. We know that engaging families of detained youth benefit them both. We must help families develop skills to effectively interact with youth while in placement and upon their release. One of the things we've noted is that as children are released and they're out in their family, with their families, year 1, they're doing well. Year 2, they may be doing well. But closer to that 3-year mark, when we're measuring whether or not they recidivate, we find that they are no longer doing as well as they were when they first got out. We must continue to develop programs and protocols and interventions to help youth for those first 3 years all the way to the end so that we can help them have better outcomes and also avoid recidivism. We must also continue to recognize that youth will be released from placement, they will return to their communities, and communities need tools to help address these issues as well. Unfortunately, childhood abuse, neglect, and exposure to other traumatic stressors, also known as childhood ACE experiences, bear with me one second. We also are focusing on one program that we think is important, working with HUD. That is addressing issues of children's expungement, sealing, and other kinds of issues regarding driver's licenses when they get out. We're hoping to be able to help them as one part of their reentry process. Today, our charge is to discuss the care that goes into assessing and addressing trauma for system-involved youth and adults, yet realizing that the very best approach that we can take is find ways to keep kids out of the system rather than addressing issues once they get into the system. So our focus at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention is to focus on early intervention, comprehensive system reform, and system reform involving pre-arrest diversion, arrest, diversion after arrest, and other kinds of community-based options that help keep our system closer to home, closer to their families, closer to their school systems, and having opportunities that don't involve them going to the systems that are very high priced. We hope that you continue to work diligently in your community. We know that you're on the front lines, and we're looking forward to working with you as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Administrator Listenbee, for your leadership and for your passion around these issues. I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists so that we can get right into the topics in hand. And from your left to right, I would like to start out with Mr. Daryl McGraw. Daryl McGraw is the Associate Director of the Office of Recovery Community Affairs for the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. He works in the areas of policy development, contract management, project coordination, which include collaborations with many grassroots peer organizations and the Connecticut Department of Corrections. Seated next to him is Dr. Monique Marrow, who is a child clinical psychologist and serves as a training specialist for the Center on Trauma and Children. And seated next to her is Ms. Lori Beyer. And Ms. Beyer is the Director of Trauma Training and the lead trainer at Community Connections, which is a private not-for-profit agency that provides a full range of behavioral health services in metropolitan Washington, D.C. I have not done justice to their bios. Their bios are in your application, and please look them up because they are quite impressive. With that, we are going to start with Mr. McGraw for some comments, and we will move from there then to Dr. Marrow, and then from there to Ms. Beyer. Daryl?
Thank you. So, my name is Daryl McGraw, and as I was introduced as the Associate Director of the Office of Recovery Community Affairs for the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services in Connecticut. So that's a pretty decent title. When I was 6 years old, I didn't know what I wanted to be. Like a lot of children, I wanted to be a bunch of different things. But I remember this conversation. My mom sat me down and she said that we were moving and my dad wasn't coming. And so we were moving so she told us we were moving and my dad wasn't coming. And we moved into this big, big building, which later I found out was the projects. And so things were done a lot differently in the projects. A lot of things were done differently. Two things that I noticed right away is that the other kids in the projects, they didn't have dads either. So that wasn't a big surprise. Like when I came outside and I started playing, they didn't have dads either. So it was odd because I was accustomed to having a father. And now, at 6 years old, my role had changed to being a caregiver for my brother. So I was given a key, and I was told that I had to bring my brother upstairs and to the babysitter, and then go to get on the bus and go to school. This was at 6 years old. And then when I got out of school, I was told to pick my brother up, go back in the house, lock the door, and be quiet because this was our first family secret. And when I was asked to speak here today, I didn't really understand about trauma. Or at the time, I didn't understand that I was experiencing some trauma at that time that my dad had been gone. As time went on, growing up in the projects, I noticed that the second thing that I noticed, everything was settled with violence. There was a lot of violence. One of the twins, there were two twins that we grew up with, and within about 6 months of living there, their dad had shot their mom. And I remember this day because we used to go up to the 12th floor to visit the blood stain that stayed on the wall because no one ever washed the blood stain off the wall where she had died, where her hand had slid down the wall, so that was still there. And so when we were talking about trauma, for many years, I didn't even understand that I was experiencing trauma. I didn't even know that I was going through trauma because violence just was the way things were done where I was growing up. That's the way things were settled. There was a lot of domestic violence. There was a lot of physical violence if you had a problem. Even the seniors, the older people would say, if you can't beat them, pick up something and hit them in the head with it. They'll leave you alone. So that was a process that I grew up with. So as I got older, became, I picked up the trade. I learned a few other things. I became a drug dealer. I started selling drugs. And in that craft, we also, violence was a part of that. And so on and so forth. So as I moved on through life, violence was one of the things that pretty much was a common theme in my neighborhood. Growing up as a 6-year-old, having the key, that role change where I was now the caregiver, the man of the house, and I wasn't a 6-year-old kid anymore. I was responsible for my brother. Moving forward, I think that another thing that I remember, and as I go through this, and some of this is hard to tell a room full of people, because you don't revisit these. You think about these things, and you can actually visually see them. And I wanted to start off with this because the people that you work with, these are some of the things that they may never tell you when you're sitting across from them. Some of the things that, because we talk about that secret, that having the key and being the only person at home at night while your mom is working 2 jobs. Or that, the teachers never asked about no one ever talked about the twins' mom being shot. No one came to our neighborhood and asked us, how did that affect me or any of my friends? And not too much longer, maybe a few years later, our friend Frank, his father got shot in front of our building. And these are common themes. I know that this is not unique for me because if you just turn on the news, you see this all the time. One of the things that a lot of people, if you don't grow up in these environments, you don't understand why people act out, why kids act out, why a kid may be sleepy and falling asleep at his desk because maybe he's that sole provider, that man of the house. Maybe he's protecting his mom, maybe he's protecting his brother, maybe he's doing something like that. So myself, I wanted to use my story as something to think about when you're sitting across from that person, whether it be a teenager, a child, or an adult. Because as an adult, as I told you, sitting here now, I didn't even know through all those years that I was even experiencing traumatic events. And it wasn't until I started going to school and getting a little education that I realized that, wow, I had been through some trauma, and so how do we work with people? How do we address those issues with people that we work with? How do we start to identify these things? Because these are some of the things that perpetuated me from spending 10 years of my life in prison and 25 years in the street. The trauma that I experienced when I was a youth only just kept going. And one of the things that I want to point out, I see that I'm getting short on time, and I want to make sure I get some points in, that one of the things that I wanted to point out, that in that environment, the tougher you are, that's kind of the street cred. And going to jail was acceptable, and that was a badge of honor. And these myths, or whatever you want to call them, still exist in our communities. So when we're talking about trauma-informed care, we have to also let people know that you don't have to live this certain way. You don't have to sell drugs to have a nice car. You don't have to assault people. You don't have to pick up something and hit them in the head with it in order to get your point across. In closing, I would be remiss to say that in Connecticut, I'm always advocating for peer support. And peer support is having people like me who's nervous speaking in front of a crowd of people like you. But I'm willing to take this one for the team in order so we can implement more peer support for so many of those that need it. Because if it wasn't for people with lived experience, a lot of us have that clinical knowledge and book smarts, but if you haven't actually been there and experienced what it was like to live in those environments and being able to talk about what it's like to come out of it and get to the other side, that's how we're gonna start winning. We have to get people with lived experience, people with peer support. Peer support, if your team doesn't have someone with lived experience on it, that's where you're going wrong. You need that peer support model. And I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues who are going to go into the clinical aspect of it. Thank you.
Mr. McGraw, thanks so much for sharing your story. Dr. Mero, you're next. I would ask you to stay approximately 6 inches away from the mic so we can limit the feedback. So we'll keep an eye or an ear on that, if you will.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I think it's interesting when I listen to Daryl talk about, his lived experiences, and particularly when he talks about the fact that, growing up and probably much into his adult life, he really didn't understand or wouldn't have categorized himself as a person who's experienced trauma. And I think that becomes a critical piece to understand, because trauma is more than just the PTSD diagnosis, which some people talk about. And it is actually an entire experience that really changes and creates the fabric of who you are. So that when we look at individuals with trauma, we often like to talk about things in very compartmentalized ways, to talk about trauma, addiction, mental health, delinquency, all of those things kind of separately. But for many people, trauma is just the way in which they see the world, that it really changes the way that they think, the way that they feel, the way that they behave. And at its core, trauma is something that will have really lasting impacts on the way in which they interact. So one of the things that I want to think about is that when I look at trauma, power is a huge piece, or at least powerlessness is a huge piece of trauma. That trauma really strips one's sense of dignity, control, and capacity to make change. And so when you look at it from that perspective, when we look at trauma, dealing with trauma really talks about how you begin to address that. So as you can see on the screen, some of the core constructs that you want to really look at include things like safety, okay? So many people who experience trauma don't experience their sense of safety, and that's physical safety, and that's also emotional or psychological safety, which means that I feel that I can live in a community and know that I will be safe. I also feel that I'm in a space where others will respect who I am. Others will be able to take note of me, that I feel that when I go to school and enter the classroom, that I have the opportunity to learn and there won't be things happening to me. So safety is a key piece when we look at dealing with trauma. The other thing to think about, as I kind of neglected to say, is that when we do trauma responsive work, so the word trauma-informed care has been around for a little bit. And while I like the term, and I definitely agree with the term, I like to kind of flip it a little bit to say we really need to be trauma responsive. And the reason for that is a lot of people go to a lot of trainings, and they learn a lot of information about trauma. But the application of those principles are really what it means to be a trauma-responsive system. And so those principles, or some of the core principles, are things like safety, which we've talked about. And it has to not just be for safety for the people in the systems, but also the people who are providing services. So that becomes a key piece. The second is empowerment. And I think that when we talk about that stripping, empowerment is important because we need to really think about the ways in which we give opportunities to people that empowers them. So a huge piece of the juvenile justice system, as well as the adult system, is a focus on things like family engagement. And we will talk about, if you match family engagement and you really look at the issue of power, you'd have to say, are we just inviting people to the table, or are we allowing them to set the table? Because if you allow them to set the table and set the agenda and have peers involved, then you're really empowering people to be able to form a system that they are a part of. And so empowerment, when you think about it from that perspective, is a trauma-responsive construct. So there are things like the other things up there, choice and collaboration, and in addition to that, we talk about an entire trauma philosophy. And a trauma philosophy is one that includes making sure that we, in our core values, are including an understanding that people experience trauma. And then finally, when we think about trauma competence, you say, well, what is trauma competence? Well, that's all that piece is about education and understanding. But one of the things that we do a lot of days is we sit and we say, we're going to educate our staff, or we're going to educate stakeholders. And sometimes we forget that a huge piece about that is educating those we serve. You don't have to provide what we call trauma-specific services or do intensive therapy to provide education to individuals so that they understand that, hey, I'm not crazy, that these are things that happen to me that impact the way that I see the world and the strategies that I select to be able to navigate that world. So those become an important piece. So one of the things that I'm often asked is, so what does being trauma-informed or trauma-responsive look like? I'm in juvenile justice is the predominant area that I work in, and I really focus on trauma. And so a few years ago, I had the opportunity to do some work with a state agency because I was a part of it. And we were dealing with some pretty specific things. We were dealing with, as many of you are familiar, with lawsuits. So and if you look at a lawsuit, it becomes, we were sued in multiple areas. So that would include education, mental health, social services, conditions of confinement, everything you can think of was a subject of the lawsuit. And so I looked at this as an opportunity to say, what can we do differently that can bring a lot of those things together? And so we worked to develop an entire committee of individuals who were really focused on how we were going to begin to make change. And as a function of that, what we did was we kind of looked at a number of different areas. And I'm just looking down because the slides are moving. So one of the things that we did was we said, okay, how can we work to make difference? And a big piece of it was all about trauma. We recognized that the people in our system were experiencing trauma, the young people, and the staff were experiencing trauma. So being able to look at how we collectively dealt with that. And so we developed a number of committees, and our first committee there was workforce development, and the other committees we focused on were things like treatment, policy, looking at how we were going to provide direct services. We really focused on our environments because, to be honest, a lot of us do black box work. If you have trauma, we say, you need to go to treatment, you need to go to therapy, we're going to recommend you go see the psychologist. But when you walk back out of that office, particularly in a corrections environment, nothing has changed. So to me, treating trauma is really about helping people have experiences that change those core relationships with others. And so we had a number of different committees. And so one of the things that I want to point out is when we look at all those, I'm going to go backwards, sorry. Look at all of those different committees, we did a whole process of changing the way we asked questions so that we were screening and assessing for trauma. The second thing we really did is take a look at all of our policies and procedures and say, is the language in those and the practices in those consistent with a trauma-responsive practice? And so we were able to make some modifications there. We were able to say, you know what, our workforce needs to understand this issue. So we did some workforce development. And finally, we said, well, the youth need an opportunity, if they desire, to do some trauma-responsive types of interventions. And then finally, we said, the environment in which kids live and experience the day and where our staff spend most of the time need to also be reflective of this and to give the opportunity to practice all those skills that we were talking about. And so we modified our environments to make them feel psychologically much safer, to give spaces where staff and youth could communicate and talk and engage in relationships, which really is also at the core of what we need to do for trauma. And so that became our new way of doing business. Now, we had the opportunity at that point to say, we're going to do this on about 3 units. And then we're going to do just what we normally do on the other 2 units. And so my last slide here really speaks to what can happen when you do something differently. And so we basically looked at what do our seclusion rates look like between the 2 units, what do our restraint rates look like between the 2 units. We measured things like youth threats, and I've got 1 slide there, but if you looked at all of those slides, you would find that all of those things declined on the units where we actually changed our culture and changed our practice. And so that's really what I encourage you to think about is how will you change your culture? How will you change your practice to take on the challenge of working with individuals who experience trauma? Thank you.
And now Lori Beyer.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I feel very passionate about doing trauma-specific care and trauma-informed, and I would like to talk with you this afternoon about what happens to an individual who experiences trauma as a child or as an adolescent, and if that trauma goes untreated, what then happens to them in adulthood? And what we know is that we see higher rates of addictions. I don't need to tell you that the rates are, incredibly high. We're looking at rates with trauma survivors of probably over 80% of them, possibly even higher, that are using substances. As Dr. Folletti from the ACE study said, for trauma survivors, drugs and alcohol weren't the problem, they were the solution. And he wasn't trying to say they were the best solution or the healthiest, but they were the quickest solution for them to be able to change mood and affect, to be able to change their life, to be able to deal with the horrible things that had happened to them, to deal with the flashbacks and memories. What we also see are incredibly high rates of depression and anxiety. And what I know is that many of them are not diagnosed as having depression or anxiety. Rather, often how they appear to all of us is as very angry people who are reacting against us and against the system. And what we know is that often that depression and anxiety goes undiagnosed and untreated. But rather we see them as angry and rageful, acting out, assaulting other people, assaultive behaviors that then get them charges and so on. And what's underneath is often fear and loss and abandonment, and fears that they will be a victim once again. So if I act out, that hope that I won't be that victim again. And then what we also see are many of them having emotional dysregulation issues. And I don't need to tell you that, do I? That one minute they're fine and the next minute they're ready to hurt someone else or to hurt themselves. And that inability to regulate their emotions well also causing many difficulties across their lives, whether it's holding a job, holding housing, being able to follow the rules when it comes to their incarceration, whether it comes to their probation and parole. But that emotional dysregulation is a huge issue that many of them, because of what has happened to their brain development, might not be able to regulate as well. But also the behaviors that they saw around them in the homes where they grew up, in those toxic environments, that they didn't necessarily have the modeling about how do I control my emotions, how do I do it differently. And that what we also see are sometimes medical conditions that they're presenting. What we know is that oftentimes internalizing the trauma and abuse that has happened to you, and then resulting in gastrointestinal issues, irritable bowel syndrome, colitis, ulcers, things like that. Then how do we see those issues come out in their lives? Again, what we see are high rates of incarceration, but also other issues. As I mentioned before, the joblessness, unable to get a job and to keep a job, the homelessness, also high rates of domestic violence. Oftentimes for trauma survivors, they are taking out the impact of the trauma and abuse on those people around them. And unfortunately, it's often the people that they care about the most, their partners, their children. I have never worked with a trauma survivor who ever said that they wanted to hurt the people that they cared about. But unfortunately, again, because of that emotional dysregulation, because of the issues of power and control, and not being able to live their lives differently, hurting those very people that they love. And then we see those rates of intergenerational violence and abuse that go from, again, one generation to another. And with trauma treatment, with trauma-specific and trauma-informed care, we really want to stop that violence from going from one generation to another. Now, that's all the bad news. Now can I tell you the good news? There is treatment for trauma and abuse. And so I wanted to focus on some of those treatment interventions. TREM, of course, I'm mentioning that because I'm from the organization that developed that model, but also other models that you're aware of, Seeking Safety, helping men recover, helping women recover. And also I want to mention that all of these models that I've mentioned here also have applications for adolescents. And I think that you all know of other trauma-specific interventions, especially for children and adolescents, whether it's TFCBT or other models, trauma-specific models that you're doing. Now, these that are on the screen, I think are very important because they're all group models. And I think that what Daryl mentioned before, that he did not identify himself as a trauma survivor. And again, I believe that many of the people, maybe I should say even most of the people that you're working with, will not identify themselves as such. And what is so powerful often about a group model is that peer support. People coming together, sharing their stories with each other. I think that many of us, you can identify with that saying, can't you? What goes on in this house stays in this house, that you don't talk about it. So most trauma survivors have never shared it with someone else. And so the power of being in a group and being able to share their stories, to learn from each other, can just be incredibly helpful. And also, most of these models also can be adapted for individual work, because what we also know is that sometimes trauma survivors are not willing to go to a group, are not willing to share that with other people. And again, that secret that they've held for so long. And I think especially for many of them, that overwhelming feeling that I've been a victim and I never want to be a victim again. And so that defensiveness, that posturing that they've done in order to stop themselves from ever being victimized again. And so then I want to focus on some of the principles that these models and others are really working on. And some of those are about psychoeducation. We believe that just because someone has experienced trauma and abuse, that oftentimes they don't understand the impact that it has had on their lives. And that's why we believe that psychoeducation is so important. I believe most of the trauma survivors you work with, their identity is not around being a trauma survivor. If you were to ask them why they are the way they are, they would tell you either because I'm a criminal, because I'm an addict, or because I have mental health concerns. And often never in that equation is the causality or the reason because I have experienced trauma and abuse. That's why we believe psychoeducation is so incredibly important, to be able to help them to understand trauma happened to you, and this is how you have adapted to it. This is how it has played a part in your life. So being able to help them to understand that possibly that raging and fighting, that came out of a very normal response of not wanting to be that victim again. So you found ways to put up that wall, to keep people away from you, to let them know, as Daryl said, you know, I'm not a punk, you can't take advantage of me. And that gave them that shield in which then they could feel like they were protecting themselves. And I think that was very important, because for many trauma survivors, they don't want to ever say, I did nothing, that the perpetrator did something to me and I did nothing in response to it. Helping them to understand that for other trauma survivors, maybe it's not the raging and fighting, it's the isolation. That they isolated themselves, no one can know about my secret, if I don't get close to anyone, they won't be able to hurt me. And then having difficulties figuring out who they can trust. Most trauma survivors, they trusted the person who hurt them. Now they're left knowing, who can I trust? Because again, that person, that authority figure who hurt me, I was told that I could trust them. What we also want to do in trauma-specific interventions is skill building. We know that trauma survivors develop skills. Those were the skills for adaptation. That was what they had to do at the time in order to get by. Now what we know is that oftentimes those skills don't translate into adulthood. those skills that they learned in order to get by, whether it was the raging and the fighting? Or what about sometimes the lying that they had to do? You know, again, the secrets that they had to keep, they couldn't tell other people in their lives what was really going on at home. They couldn't even admit to themselves often what was going on because it wasn't accurately labeled that mom or dad has a substance abuse problem and they're being abusive to me. So instead they learned to label it something else. And now what we're trying to do is helping them to recognize you developed this skill for a reason. Now what we'd like to help you to do is to develop an alternative skill, one that will help you to be able to move forward in your life and to be able to become the person that you want to be, the person that you need to be in order to be able to accomplish the goals that you have for yourself. And we also want to do with trauma survivors the cognitive restructuring, helping them to understand themselves and their lives in the context of what has happened to them. In trauma-informed care, it's not, you know, what's wrong with you, but the real question is what has happened to you. And we want to help them to understand and to be able to label these experiences. As Daryl said, the problem being able to identify that what happened to me wasn't just normal and that I should just be able to let it roll off my back, but that this really was trauma and abuse, and it has had an impact on my life, on my behaviors, and on the outcomes that I've seen so far. And with trauma-specific work and with trauma-informed, I think that we can address all of these issues.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for sharing your personal experiences and your incredible knowledge about trauma, about the impact of trauma, and about ways that we can respond to trauma survivors. We have just a few minutes left, so we're going to do a version of speed question and answer. I have a few questions that I would like to ask, and if we could fairly quickly go back and forth in terms of responding, we'll fit in as many as we can before we run out of time. The first one, Dr. Merrow, there's a lot of talk about sometimes trauma-informed is something we add on. And really, we're beginning to understand that's not accurate. What would you say is the role of trauma-informed care in the fields of mental health, substance abuse treatment, and in correctional treatment, where the main model is risk, need, and responsivity? How do these things mesh together in a way to make sense for folks?
Thank you. So I think that definitely trauma to me is not an add-on. It is essentially a way in which you might deliver services and the way in which you interact with individuals. So when I look at something specific like risk, needs, responsivity, one of you all know that responsivity are all those things that you have to address to be able to help the person to be able to deal directly with the risk variables. And so some of the most common risk variables related to this would include things like even something as simple as education. So if you want an individual to go to school, you have to be able to deal with the barriers that get in the way of them going to school. Well, some of them go to schools that are very violent and have experienced multiple traumas in that school setting. So being able to help them to be able to deal with those becomes important in terms of getting them to school. Another one is, as I think Lori kind of talked about, was this issue of substance use. And so if substance use is a way that I adapt and numb out and deal with all of the horrific stuff that has happened to me, then you can't use a typical substance abuse model without incorporating knowledge of trauma. And so for me, when you look at risk, needs, and responsivity, it's a responsivity variable because it is a driver for so many of the behavioral health, mental health, substance abuse issues that exist and the risks.
Thank you very much. Starting down at the end of the panel with Ms. Beyer and moving our way down, I have a question that I'd like a response from each panelist from, and that is thinking about the future and thinking about where we have already come in terms of understanding trauma and the work that has been done so far. Where do we need to go next? What's left? What are the next steps that you think we need to be thinking about and moving toward?
Well, I think that, as I said, trauma-informed care is a I would see the next steps as being able to implement more trauma-specific treatment programs in across the United States with the populations that you're working with, making it more available. Often what we find is that there's limited availability and knowledge and skill level to be able to do those programs. Also, I think the next step is also, and I think that it was mentioned here, but being able to recognize that trauma-informed care, having the knowledge and information is just the first step. The second step is how do we use that knowledge and information to change our behaviors, to change our culture, the way that we act. And then do we see the difference that it makes? And then how does that reinforce and sustain us? And how does it help us to then go forward and continue to do it more? And I think that Dr. Merrow's slide in regard to the impact that they saw helps us to understand that trauma-informed care, when really done, can make a huge difference and a huge impact in our programs.
Dr. Merrow?
You want to respond?
Each person all the way down.
Okay. So when I think about, what we need to be able to do next, I'd say in addition to doing some of the very trauma-specific services, as I alluded to previously, that we really need to ensure that we have adequate training, support, and supervision for our workforce so that they are capable of doing a better job of interacting with individuals as well as keeping their own sense of safety and sanity while doing it. So that becomes a key piece, because to me, trauma is not necessarily healed by itself in therapy, that's a piece of it. But that really trauma is something that is healed in the context of relationships with others and experiences. So trauma occurs as a function of one's experiences, and that we form lives around that. And so I just want to reiterate that to me, you really have to involve people in trusting relationships, to give opportunities, to teach new ways and alternative ways of dealing with the really real issues that people experience.
Mr. McGraw, any comments?
I would say that the best way to deal with the trauma would be to be adding peers, trauma-informed groups that actually teach peers how to deal with their trauma, but also, like I tried to do today, was give you my story, bits and pieces of my story, and see how you could use that story as a tool to help others get through their trauma as well. So people understand that they're not alone, they're not unique. That didn't just happen to you, this also happened to me, this is my story. We've seen that has been very powerful. So having peers on your team and teaching them how to use their story as a tool is going to be very effective in the future.
And Administrator Listenbee.
Thank you. Prior to becoming an administrator of Ojjdp, I worked as a public defender for 27 years. During that time, I reviewed psychological and psychiatric evaluations of literally hundreds and hundreds of young people in the juvenile justice system. I thought at that time that if I provided them housing, jobs, a caring adult, a place to stay, those would be the tools to move them out of the juvenile justice system. I was wrong. Trauma is the single most important tool that I've discovered that we have in our juvenile justice system to better understand our children and provide a method for caring and addressing their needs and issues that has been missing. And I'm hoping that many of you will adopt all the techniques that were discussed here and many others. But I think what we need are comprehensive citywide and comprehensive statewide trauma-informed systems. The city of Philadelphia, the city of Baltimore have adopted, and made themselves, or in the process of making themselves, trauma-informed systems. In the Department of Justice, we're focused on moving from simply criminal justice to public health models that look at what the root causes are, and I believe trauma-informed care is one of the addressing the root causes. Finally, one of the major recommendations coming out of the task force was that we have a public awareness campaign on the importance of addressing trauma and children's exposure to violence. Next year, 2016, we plan to roll out a public awareness campaign that focuses in the same way that people focused on, people wearing seatbelts, stopping smoking, becoming aware of trauma as being critical to addressing the needs of our children in our juvenile justice system.
Thank you so much. And finally, we come to the poll results. You were all been polled, and we have some results for you that I will just share with you very briefly in terms of the question. And we may have this, I'm going to have to go over here to get our little light. There we go, it's going up there. The problem, of course, is that, there we go. Thank you so much, those in the back. In screening for trauma, do you use different screening tools for youth and adults was the question. And over 40% of you said, yes, you do. That's very good. About 8% of you said that you don't do it separately, that you use the same instrument for both youth and adults. And then about 29% of you said you don't screen for trauma at all, which is something that we hope people will begin to do more of after today. And about almost 23% of you said you don't know, and so we hope that you'll go back and find out whether or not that does occur, and if not, that again, you will begin to do that or begin to think about how to do that in your various programs and systems. One last time, please join me in thanking this wonderful panel for their work and for their talk today.